Welcome to the Emerging Literacy training video. Video 1. In Video 1, we explore the theory behind emerging literacy in Highland. For this video, you will need a writing implement and something to write on. At points in the video, there will be opportunities for you to pause for individual reflection or as a small group.
The basic idea of the emerging literacy approach is to be aware of the developmental state of each child and to match teaching and learning to what they are needing. In Highland, we have a way of checking on children's development in preschool called the Developmental Overviews. It covers these main developmental areas in a very parent-friendly way, and you can probably see looking at them that at least two of them are very important for early literacy. Here's an example of a blank overview. For each child, if an item is secure, it's coloured in green. If it's emerging, it's yellow. And if it's an area of concern or not seen yet, it's left blank. And the idea is to give a quick and easy visual overview of where a child's strengths and developments are and also where are the gaps. Each child coming into P1 in Highland should have a completed developmental overview. The idea is not to provide a comprehensive assessment or to replace assessments that teachers will want to do themselves, but to give a quick and easy heads up as to the pattern of developmental needs across a class. Many P1 teachers find that this helps with their early planning, either for a whole class or for individual pupils who have a high level of developmental need.
At this point, pause the video and discuss how can this information help you at the beginning of Primary 1.
To help address developmental gaps, you can find some useful strategies suggested by occupational therapists and speech and language therapists and others on the website Bumps to Bends. This is routinely used in early years settings in Highlands to work with parents in addressing developmental gaps. In the next few slides, we're going to be exploring the kinds of skills which are important not just for early literacy, but which can partly determine later attainment as well. To do this, we'd like to start by giving you a really easy task. You'll need a pen and a piece of paper, and I'm going to ask you to write the following sentence. So please write down the following. In the winter, it often snows. In the winter, it often snows.
Please feel free to pause the video at this point to complete the task.
So because this is a video, I can't see whether that was an easy task for you, but most adults don't have much problem with it. What I'd like you to do is think about what you were doing when you did that. What did you have to be able to do to make that task easy? What knowledge did you need? What skills did you need? Or anything else you think that contributed to performing that task.
At this point, you should think about or discuss the different knowledge, skills, or other things needed to complete that task. Please pause the video.
So you may have ended up with quite a long list of different skills. Some of the things you may have will include conventions like writing from left to right or using punctuation or capital letters. We can group these under the title Concepts of Print. It's all the things we often take for granted but which children don't necessarily know. This also includes motivational aspects such as what literacy is for, why you might write, why you might read, and then how to use print to get things done. Then you might have a list which is all about spelling. You might have talked about finding the right letters for the sounds. You might have realised that to do that, you have to be able to hear the individual words in the sentence. Then you've got to be able to hear the individual sounds inside the words. This is something we do so effortlessly, we forget that children have to learn this. If you want to know what it's like for a small child, it's a bit like when you go abroad and you can't really hear the words in a foreign language. And then you might have a whole cluster of skills around oral language. You have to know a word in order to be able to write it. or in order to be able to read it. But you also need to understand about sentence structure. And then lastly, you might have talked about some of the writing skills. You might have talked about being able to form the letters, being able to match the letter on the page with the picture you had of it in your head, being able to coordinate your hand, and even being able to balance and not fall over as you press down on the paper. And these are a whole cluster of fine motor skills. In this video, we're going to be looking in a bit of detail, mostly at phonological awareness. Those are the skills in your spoken language about hearing words and sounds. But before we do this, let's see why it matters. Here's a graph. It's not as bad as it looks. It's a graph of attainment at the end of S4 in Highland children a couple of years ago, and the pattern has been the same year on year. The scale upwards is a measure of attainment, and then from left to right is a measure of deprivation. And you can probably see a very clear pattern that children from more deprived areas do less well in S4 than children from less deprived areas. The thing is that we can predict this. So this graph shows you the developmental skills of children going into P1 last year. Blue are children from more deprived areas, and red are children from less deprived areas. And you can hopefully see the gap in skills. There's lots of international research now that shows that skills on school entry are a very strong predictor of educational outcomes at 16 and life outcomes even further into life. We shouldn't feel hopeless about this. What this means is that if we can adapt early in teaching learning to the skills level of children, then we might be able to defeat that prediction and we won't see those inequalities in later life. So again, that same international research shows us which skills are important to address, and it's exactly the ones that you came up with when you looked at that easy task, and they fall into these 4 areas. So that little writing task we gave you, it is easy if you have all those many different skills, if they're coordinated, if they come out in the right order, and here's probably the most important concept, if they are automated. So we're going to take a couple of minutes to explain what that means.
Either think about or discuss with a person next to you. If you drive, what was it like the first time that you drove a car? Think about this and compare that with how it might be now. You should now pause the video.
So there are a few lucky people who just sit in a car and can drive it straight away. But what most people remember is that it was a bit more chaotic. They might have had trouble coordinating pressing the clutch and moving the gear lever, or finding the windscreen wipers, or remembering to indicate or to look in the mirror. Certainly it took up all their attention and there wasn't time to think about where you were going, and processing even simple directions might have been quite difficult. The experience now is hopefully a bit more smooth. You probably don't have to think about each and every single action. It's probably a bit more effortless, so you can listen to the radio while you drive along, or hold a conversation, or remember where you are going, or think about what you're going to do when you get there. That different feeling is the difference between skills which are automated and skills which are not. And we're going to show you that difference now in a very simple activity. I'd like you to imagine that next Christmas, in front of an invited audience, you are going to be asked to juggle these. How many hours practice would you like to have before you'd be completely comfortable doing that? Okay, so imagine instead of those soft balls, you were going to be invited to juggle these priceless Ming Dynasty vases. But suppose you're not ready, and you just have to do it anyway. What might be the possible behavioural reactions? Well, you might refuse, or you might only try juggling 1 or 2, or not throwing them so high. Or you might just bash on and make a mess of it. So if you think about those reactions of refusing, not putting in a lot of effort, or just carrying on and making a mess. I wonder if you ever see any reactions like that with literacy tasks. And this is why automating skills through practice is so important, because they become effortless and don't use capacity in the brain. And that means that the child has room to think about other things, like what they were wanting to say, or space in their mind to comprehend the text that they're reading. So if you imagine that a child has to think effortfully about holding a pencil, spacing, going from right to left, where one word ends or another begins, that entire list of skills that you made with our easy task, you can see why they might have much less capacity left for thinking about what to say or thinking about what they're reading. So hopefully you can start to see how later attainment in primary and secondary starts to depend on how well these early skills are embedded for each child. So if that holds true for writing, is it the same for reading? We're going to show you some examples to demonstrate that it is. Once you know how to read, you can't really forget how to read. We've put 3 sentences on this slide where we've jumbled up the text, even missing out letters, and most people find them relatively easy to read. So now we're going to demonstrate that you can't not read. It is that automatic. On the next slide, we're going to flash up an instruction. I'd like you to imagine that it's really, really important that you obey this instruction. There. Did you manage to obey that message? Of course you didn't. That's because reading for you is automatic and effortless. So let's try and imagine what it was like not being able to read. What was it like at first when we tried to read? We're going to give you a couple of minutes to stare at this sentence. I promise that it's phonetically regular. See if you can puzzle out some of the words. And as words occur to you, if you're with other people, call them out to give them a hand.
Have a think about, or discuss with others, the words that you can recognise on the slide. You should now pause the video.
So some people stare at that for ages and no words jump out, and that's perfectly fine. But other people pick out words such as think, or reading, or easy. If you're desperate to know what the whole sentence says, then it's this. Try this if you think reading is easy. I'd like you to think about why some of those words jumped out more easily than others. What it is about think and reading that made them stand out. In fact, you've used a lot of language knowledge and a lot of reading knowledge to read that sentence. There are very few words in English that end NK. It could be drink, it could be think. Similarly, the NG ending is usually ING, and you might have used context to think that this is about reading and not about fishing. So actually, that exercise is not at all what it's like learning to read, because in order to decode that successfully, you've used nearly all the emerging literacy skills that a lot of children don't have. So on the next few slides, we're going to try and show you what it's really like trying to learn to read for the first time. Okay, here it is. Why do you think this is difficult to read? There can be lots of reasons, but one of the first ones might be that you don't know the letters. Well, that's fine, because we're going to give you a magic Hebrew phonics course. So on the next slide, it'll be as though you've had a phonics course downloaded into your brain and you can now read Hebrew. How's that then? Has the phonics helped you to read that sentence? Most people say no. They say, well, we've got the sounds now, but it's still a jumble of letters. You can't see where the words are. Well, that's all right. I'll read it to you now. Bereshith barach Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Did that help? Probably not, because you probably can't hear word boundaries in Hebrew. You can do it in English fine, but not in another language. OK then, I'll give you the word boundaries on the next slide. It's probably still difficult to read, and that's for the obvious reasons that you don't know the words. You haven't got enough Hebrew vocabulary to know what this says. And also, you may not know that Hebrew goes from right to left instead of from left to right. So what this example shows is how difficult it is to learn to read, even with excellent phonics instruction, if you do not have the emerging literacy skills, the concepts of print, the phonological awareness, and the knowledge of oral language. And you'd certainly find it impossible to write without the necessary fine motor skills. That probably makes intuitive sense, but does research back it up? We've put up here an example of a study done in America a few years ago with the equivalent of our P1 children. It's a useful study because it was done in real classrooms with real teachers without any extra special resources or programs. What they did was they did regular evidence-based phonics programs, which we know are the most helpful ways to teach children to read. But they combined this with activities to build the children's phonological skills based on what the skill level of the children was. So some children had more help with word boundaries and rhymes and detecting sounds, and some children who were secure in those did other things. What the researchers were interested in was 3 years later what percentage of children had reading difficulties. So in the control schools, 20% of the children had some kind of difficulty with reading, and that's about the normal level. That's what you'd expect from the tests that they used. So the control schools were where they'd just done business as usual, and they hadn't done the developmental adaptations at the same time. In the intervention schools, where they'd paid attention to the children's developmental gaps, 5% of the children 3 years later had some kind of difficulty with reading. So there's lots of ways of seeing this study, but one way to interpret it is that paying attention to the developmental aspects of early literacy means that you can prevent preventable literacy difficulties. And there's a sign in this data of the later primary sag in literacy attainment starting to be prevented. And it's exactly the same for motor skills. What occupational therapists tell us is that how well integrated children are with their movement, with their coordination, with their hand-eye coordination, it predicts how well they can copy letters. So handwriting instruction needs to recognise the natural variations in maturity among children at this age. And some children will need much more work to develop their motor skills before they can benefit from a formal handwriting programme.
You have now reached the end of Emerging Literacy Video 1. You should now proceed on to Emerging Literacy Video 2, Phonological Awareness.